Next, I want to introduce Jon Oleson. And as it turns out, I think that Jon is a familiar face around Bloomington because of his service to our community as well as having been a daymaker. So he is currently serving on the Bloomington City Council representing District 4. That's the northeast quadrant of the city. Jon is also up for election on the ballot in November, and he's an advocate for youth and a sustainable environment. Jon has published a book titled "What Legacy Are We Going to Give What Legacy Are We Giving Our Kids?" And you'll see there's a copy of the book on each table, I think. And he probably won't say this, but I will. He would love to put those in your hands on the way out. And I think, are they $15, Jon? $15. So that would be, and you'll get a snapshot of what the book is about when he speaks. The book gives us a look in the corners and crevices of American life, the everyday dynamics where Oleson sees legacies being created. He asks readers with kids in their lives to consider how they are impacting the minds of youth with their everyday actions. Do we model divisive actions or do we model collaborative actions? Youth will follow what they see, and so we're modeling for them every day. So with that, I would like to introduce Jon Oleson.
Thank you, Deb. Do any of you remember the Gong Show?
What?
We're gonna hide that veil.
This okay, Tim? Thanks. It's nice when you can say one simple phrase or a simple question in this case, and it communicates so far beyond what those few words said. And so so some of you know that I don't know if it's the passion in me or a flaw of some sort, but I have a tendency to want to talk longer than is appropriate. So I've asked her, and she may choose to do the gong instead, but I've asked her to give me a 5, and she said if that doesn't work, she'll hover. And I am responsive to a lot of nonverbals, and I tend to look for them. So on your tables, I put out a couple of copies of this book, and on the cover is a real clue as to the reason why the book was written. 3 of the kids there, the photo shoot was in Hopkins. I was looking for a busy street, and they were going to all be looking the other way, and I was going to be holding their hand, exemplifying that adults are responsible for kids. But this is a shot that the photographer said, you've got to consider this, and checking with the parents, it was okay, which was my concern ahead of time. But 3 of my 9 grandchildren who live in the eastern end of Eden Prairie, and the other 3 are children of a good friend of one of my sons. They went to school together in Duluth and have remained good friends, and we hang out together every once in a while. The answer, I apologize, I tried to sell this frog along the way, then I tried to give it away and it didn't work. So. The answer to the question, what legacy are we giving our kids, is both a personal question that needs to be answered as well as a national question that needs to be answered. And what this book is basically doing is each chapter, there are 40 chapters, they're all quite short, and the intent is that people will start with something that is familiar with them to the extent it is somewhat similar to what I've experienced. The first chapter is called Chip Off the Old Block, and that one starts out with a story about how I heard that phrase and I reflected back to my childhood, and at that point it meant somebody said that to me and I understood that to mean, as a young child you kind of piece things together as to what adults are really saying, and that I was like my dad in some way. And so I reflect on that in that chapter. One of the reflection sequences is that I was surprised that I didn't think more about that as I was growing up. So I'm 72 now, and 10 years ago is when I first started thinking about that. And my parents loved me. There's no question that the influence that both my dad and my mom, my Boy Scout leader and neighbor that I refer to in the book, had a big influence on me. And none of them would have wanted me to do that without thinking it through and being myself. And so that reflection is kind of an example of how this book functions. The national piece is that we are collectively passing on a legacy to our children. And so when I wrote this book for my children, I think it's in the introduction or dedication, I'm dedicating it to my grandchildren, which automatically means that because the motive would be similar, I think, for anyone who is a grandparent, it's actually dedicated to all grandkids. I'm going to be reading the introduction. It doesn't take long, and then I'm going to give you a chance to talk a little bit at that point with questions, but then I'd like also to read a chapter called Burned Bacon Days. Portions of it, the total reading time will be less than 10 minutes. And then I want to make sure that there's plenty of time for Q&A. That's what adults prefer. And we are all adults, including our guest from across the ocean. I didn't catch where you're from, but and the frog needs a little help once in a while. I am serious when I say I'm not trying to tell anyone what to think. With this book, I am simply writing as an American who works to understand what's going on. I write from my experiences as a former teacher and administrator, a small business owner, city council member of a faith community, and a dedicated father and grandfather. I write as a fellow American interested in improving the quality and outcomes of dialogue about the state of this country. My goal, in essence, is to promote good conversation. The idea for this book began several years ago. Like most Americans, I was tired of all of the partisan bickering that had dominated Congress for years. Americans were polarizing, and I decided to do something about it. I decided to seek a seat in the United States House of Representatives. That was in 2010. A lot of you probably don't even know that I ran. Although I didn't really expect to win the election, and I didn't, I did hope to encourage better dialogue, conversation about America, about democracy, core values, and where we were going. Over the course of my campaign, I was able to engage residents, expressing my concerns and listening to theirs. My belief in America was buoyed. We're good people. I felt better during and immediately after the election. I was less anxious, and the only explanation I came up with was that I was doing something, not just griping. But the ideas and conversations I'd had along the way kept surfacing in my mind. I couldn't think about my grandchildren without wondering, worrying, what their future would be. I decided to try another strategy to move the national dialogue in a better direction. The result is this book. I write from what I have learned in my lifetime. The chapters that follow cover a sampling of the topics that describe America. They glimpse into the soul of who we are and what we stand for. Some are subtle looks, some are dynamics of America that are loud and in our faces. All require sorting through and taking apart, peeling back of the onion, so to speak, so that we see what's at the core. Who do I want to read this book? Anyone who wants to do three things. Step away from the hectic pace of life in America to reflect about life and what's the most important. Step away from the confusing, often disturbing way America does politics. And finally, and most importantly, participate in shaping America's future. The stories that launch most chapters are in this book because they have helped me get my head and heart around issues and the people dynamics that affect America's ability to understand how we best govern our nation, how we make interactions between us more effective and more productive. My stories and my processing, how they relate to America, help me understand all this. They're my perceptions, my takeaways. I offer them fully expecting that readers may be in sync with some chapters, dismayed or repulsed by some, bored by others. But my hope is that this book will provoke interesting and helpful thinking and dialogue. It is my expectation that you will resolve to increase your engagement in America's future, deciding that you can make a difference. It is my hope that you will do your part to stop the squabbling that we hear every day, that you will actively support good problem solving and good future planning. This book puts thoughts on the table for you to consider, to ponder, to stir up your creative thinking, to do some self-examination. And it is my hope that you will do your own analysis of what America values and who we want to be as a nation, as a world leader. It is my firm belief that we share similar thoughts about what we want the American experience to be for our kids and our grandkids. So that's the introduction, and I ask people to read it. Some people skip right to the first chapter, so I emphasize that. I was at a reunion for my college at Concordia Moorhead a couple of weekends ago, and as I sold books, that was one of the things they said, make sure you read the introduction. So you don't have to do that now because you heard it. Do you have any questions that you would like to get out before I go to reading most of a chapter? Okay. By the way, in Karen's invocation, she made reference to smartphones and how they are kind of taking over our lives. There is a chapter in the book called Smartphones. I prefer to call them smarty pants phones. I've said that publicly a couple times, and I've been told that my sense of humor sometimes is indirect, which I found out means that if your mind is following what my mind did before I made a statement, then you'll laugh, and some people laugh when I say that, smarty pants phones. How many of you have heard smarty pants as an expression? Yeah, it goes back to my grandparents, I think, in my case. So, if you didn't hear Karen, she said that it goes longer than my lifetime. So. Burned Bacon Days happens to be chapter 5, and the order of the chapters is, generally speaking, pretty random. There are a few that I paired up together for what I thought were good reasons. Background is that I was a teacher for 23 years and a school administrator for 10, all in the public school system. And this Burned Bacon Day started in the early 70s, early in my teaching career. I'd been teaching a couple of years when I got a lesson in just how much humans are affected by how their day is going. My students at the time were 7th, 8th, and 9th graders, the fun range of years when the transition to adolescence is in active mode. Some teens are very direct, less encumbered by political correctness than their elders. It was that sometimes bold openness that triggered a good lesson for me. This "you can learn a lot from an adolescent experience" started to roll when a still, somewhat meek 7th grader asked me a question as she left class one day. "Mr. Oleson, are you having a bad day?" I'm sure my defense mechanisms leaped into action to protect my self-image. And I probably instinctively told her, "No. Why do you ask?" I don't remember the conversation well, but I clearly recall that her comment got me thinking. I reflected about bad day dynamics over the next few days. I started by thinking that, yes, bad days happen, and many things can trigger them. The young girl's comment really pushed me to better understand how my bad days affected students, since there's a tendency for many of us to be unaware of how we come across to others. And as a teacher, I realized I really needed to understand how my bad days impacted classroom dynamics, how I affected 30 or so kids forced to be in my charge for class time. A teacher having a bad day is bound to affect many aspects of a classroom: student attitudes about adults, the willingness to get involved in classroom activities, the amount of learning that is going on. Sometimes bad days can get contagious, and trust me, you don't want 30-some adolescents holed up in one room to all get irritable. My reflecting on the incident prepared me to talk to my class the next time I realized that I was having a bad day. Driving to school one morning after a slushy snowfall in Duluth gave me the opening I wanted. I told my students at the beginning of the first period that I was having a bad day. Bad roads, some lousy drivers, and getting to school late had tensed me up. I knew I was irritable. I asked them to cut me a little slack that day. No goofing around, be sure to follow directions, stuff like that. Remembering that adolescents tend to have a hypersensitivity to fairness, I thought it wise to tell them that I would try to go easy on them when they were having a bad day. I gave them the option of letting me know as they came into class on a bad day. It was their choice if they wanted to tell me why. Somehow I realized that what I had just said could get out of hand. So I went on to say I'd get suspicious if a kid told me on a regular basis that they were having a bad day. A couple of kids did little laughs, and soon more laughed. The whole class probably imagined which kids would try to take advantage of that offer. Those couple of minutes did some wonderful things for me and ultimately for my classes from then on. Being upfront with them about having a bad day actually put me in a better mood, a benefit to me. But we all benefited in another way. Our relationship moved to being less distant. By telling students that I wasn't on top of everything, that I was letting them know that teachers are human too, and that we care about how we make students feel. My students realized schools weren't so much us, kids, and them, adults, and that we were somehow in the school business together, in the same boat, so to speak. I realized my students were attentive and seemed to appreciate the thoughts and ideas that spilled out of me. The discussion went on a bit as we exchanged examples of the variety of things that can cause bad days. I suggested that we call bad days burned bacon days. Bacon in those days was a breakfast thing, and bad days often started early. Burning the bacon would definitely be a bad start to a day, so I told them that we could use Burned Bacon Day as code for, I'm having a bad day. The name stuck. Over the next several weeks, we put the idea into effect, and I'm having a Burned Bacon Day became shorthand for, go easy on me as you can. A simple process to handle an ordinary thorn in life was born that slushy, snowy day. It ended up having some neat outcomes, which I didn't anticipate as I started that class period. All of us, me as teacher, kids as students, discovered that simply telling someone how we're feeling, that we're having a bad day, can be therapeutic. We often feel better when we share that kind of news. Expressing empathy for someone pays dividends for those on the receiving end as well as for those showing empathy. It's actually quite logical. We naturally go easy on a person having a bad day because we are fully aware that we have all had and will continue to have bad days. Part of leaving a legacy to young people can be as simple as passing such personal aha experiences on to them. I'm glad that 7th grade girl was willing to ask me if I was having a bad day. She helped me focus on an important dynamic that I needed to get my head around and better understand my classroom and better manage it. That focus has helped me develop better relationships with people throughout my life. Imagine what life in America would be like if we all helped each other get through Burned Bacon days. So, now it's time for Q&A. How much time do I have?
You're good.
Okay, that's vague enough for me. In each chapter I end up, maybe it's a teacher in me, although one of the people that helped me do some editing on this indicated early on that it was kind of an in thing with books to ask questions. And so, and I've read a chapter to a book club. I've read to the Bloomington Optimist Club. That one I chose patriotism chapter because that was close to Memorial Day. And I've done a series in my own church actually and scheduled for some other churches. The one in my church was 4 Wednesdays in a row and we took 4 chapters. So I'm going to ask you one of the 4 questions that are here, and then if you can take it off from there, I'll just ask you more questions, or you can make comments. In what contexts besides schools do we need others to cut us some slack?
Rotary meetings.
Unless you're president.
No mercy.
Does it happen in pretty much any aspect of life? Families, committees, whatever? Seems to me that it does. Do you find the benefits you receive when showing empathy are greatest with any particular type of person?
Yes, I'll hit that one in directly, John.
Okay.
One of the, it seems, you know, if America had easy problems, it would have been solved yesterday, okay? And so all you can do is highlight. But it's very hard to be empathic when you feel you're permanently screwed. And we have a lot of people in this country that feel that way and probably like me. That's something we have to deal with. At the same time, we have placed a lot more emphasis on the sheer act of competition than we used to. It's not so much doing well in school, it's doing better than who's it over there. Because that means that you're going to get something that they're not getting. And those two things, I think, are very damaging. We're having a discussion here about kids in sports. And I've had friends who, after swimming for 5 hours a day, 5 days a week in college, won't go near the water anymore. Now, when I was in college, swimming workout was an hour and a half to 2 hours. So where do we go with this, and how do you get out of this into something that is more empathic?
The example that you gave, thank you for that, is a national issue, and one that certainly requires our attention and effort. And I think that one of the reasons that I have books or chapters that are talking more on a personal level and those on a national level, and there are both, is that sometimes if we look at our own situation and we see the dynamic of empathy being shown and feel the positive, it kind of gives us some ideas about how to approach it on a national level. And like I said in the introduction, I'm not telling people how to think. I think on this issue, one of the answers that I've gotten on the personal level is that if there's somebody that is much different than I am, then it's more difficult to show empathy, in part because we don't understand why it is that they are, quote unquote, the way that they are. And my personal experience is that sometimes when I show a comment to like a homeless person and just strike up a conversation with them, or at Creekside when, I don't know if you've been there for the noon meals, but here in Bloomington, the senior center, sometimes called the community center too, but has regular meals that is, for many people, apparently their main social outlet. And so some of them are pretty reserved, maybe not too interested in exposing themselves in any way or being subjected to ridicule or something like that. And one of the things that I found is that by asking the question, tell me about what it was like, or what did you like about growing up, or tell me about your childhood home. And for many of the elder people, that's a starting point for showing that you do care, and by the nonverbal expressions of how you look at them and all that kind of thing. I forgot that we don't have a microphone going out to other people, but for questions. But any other thoughts about Burn Bacon Day chapter and how we realize that a bad day can make a big difference in somebody else and how they respond to us and how to deal with it?
John, I think this is normal. I was at a presentation, and what I'll refer to as a normal man was talking about an extraordinary experience he had to go through, and it wasn't pleasant, and the things that he had learned out of it. One of the examples that he gave that has stuck with me for a while, I've been thinking about it, is he was talking about how he used to hold the door open for a lady or someone. And if that person went through and didn't respond with thank you or something of that type, he was all, at least in his mind, he was always, well, how dare they? Thank you, man. This was an act not of me trying to do something good, but of me trying to elicit that I'm good. And that's one of the problems that we have in our society. We don't do things because we want to do good things. Sometimes we do good things because we want to hear other people tell us how good we are. And that's, I don't know how empathy fits in, but it's definitely not empathy. It's definitely not caring about our fellow man. Because that other person going through the door could have had a hell of a lot worse day than you did.
We are egocentric.
Do you want to repeat that a little bit, so it'll pick up?
Translation.
Well, for the recording.
Okay. Yeah. I don't think I focused well enough. If you want to come up and briefly state that, fine. I don't know that I could do justice to the statement, but what I'm going to do, and we have what, 5-10 minutes left?
Yeah, about 10.
Okay. I'm going to go a little bit more into the book's structure, and one of the things that I was thinking throughout as I wrote the book, and I started writing it in actually 2010. The patriotism chapter is very similar to what was on my website when I ran for the 3rd Congressional District in 2010. And yes, I got about 5% of the vote. I realized I wasn't totally naive. I was aware that unless the media caught a fancy in, here's somebody that's worth paying attention to or whatever, that I would then have a chance. But I have not been involved in any political party for 6 years. And I actually ran as an independent, and that was the year that Tom Horner was running for governor and on that ticket. And so that's where the resources went. So extremely low budget, not necessarily a record breaker, but as I said in the introduction, it improved my health to do it because I was so worked up as I was hearing the news prior to making that decision. But the chapters have been written then over the 6-7 years, and I finally decided I just have to be doing something. So I cut it off at 40 chapters. I merged a couple. There were at least 100, I think, that I started with notes. There's one chapter that I believe is entitled "Life is Precious." And that came as I was traveling along American Boulevard and at a stop sign, and a bumper on the car in front of me said, "Life is precious." And so I mused about that. And so I got started with those kinds of triggers. My faith comes out in it in a fairly indirect way. There's a chapter called "God and Electromagnetic Force." And I really kind of worried about how other people of faith, of whatever faith, might think of that. But it goes with my recalling watching the original Star Wars movie and talking about the Force. And that was, I don't know when it came out. I researched it so I got the date right in my book, but it was back in the 70s, I think, wasn't it? And there's a 78, didn't get picked up on the mic, but And I remember going out of that and for a day or two afterwards thinking, you know, the Force sounds a little bit like what in my Christian background talks about the Holy Spirit. And so I talk about my early childhood and how my faith was formed and my belief in God was formed. And, you know, that's one of the longer chapters, but it's in the book. So the values piece, it was kind of a last couple of months decision, but I decided that values keep coming to mind as this is really based on our values. So the appendix has 4 sources of my values in my chronological order. The first one was the Golden Rule, and there's a couple of references in the Christian Bible. I used one from Matthew. The Golden Rule, of course, is one that I think is in any major religion. Do unto others as you would have them do to you. The second one was as a Boy Scout, and I can still rattle off, I won't for time-wise, but Scout is trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, and all those. I can still do that. Yes! Let the video know that there are others in here are Scouts who have remembered that. So those were guidelines for me. The fact that I had to memorize them and saw them when I went to Boy Scout camp near Park Rapids, because they had little wooden signs that repeated them. So every time you went in or came out, you know, you'd have a chance to remember them. The third one was when I was teaching in government class, and there were a couple that I could have used, but I went with the preamble. We the people of the United ensure perfect union, establish justice, domestic tranquility, and so forth. And the one that I believe that starts out the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that's one that is, thank you. That's one that's there. And then the fourth one is what we just said, and I joined you, the 4 truths. And I needed to get permission and found out that the rights were actually held by an organization that is from the family of the author down in Florida. Had a nice conversation with an elderly woman that was there. And that reminds me, I said I was going to send her a book, and I haven't done that. So please, next time you see me, until I can say yes. So all of these values we pick up. That's my set of 4. And I think in the preface to the appendix, I make comment about it's good to have some reminders of that on a mirror, or however you end up doing that. To keep focused, because if we lose focus about what we are actually giving our kids by way of legacy, then we are not intentional about it. And so it'll be kind of random, it'll be slipping into the egocentricness that we have of greed or whatever else that overpowers the values that we, and I believe America in our noble documents, say we want to be. So the book's on the table. I have written my standard comment in there. Thanks for what you do to help kids experience a positive future. And so if you would like to buy a copy, I'm selling them for $15. The list is $16, and I pay the taxes. And in order to make sure that the state of Minnesota is happy, it's real important that I state that very clearly. So that's been done. So it's only $1 discount plus $1.20 or whatever it is for the tax, cheaper, but it's also easier I have a bunch of 5s with me because I am a Boy Scout and I'm prepared. And so if you are interested and have time to stay after, we can do that. The checks are to BWR LLC. BWR stands for Better Working Relationships, which is the conflict management business that I formed, still technically have, but don't market anymore. So I really appreciate this opportunity, and I look forward to some feedback of some sort, including critiques. And thank you for being Rotarians because you're doing good stuff. And yes, I'm still on the annual donation to the foundation. Thank you.